Our next guest is someone that I think I can definitely call a friend. Certainly someone who I met, and I think he will also appreciate being referred to as a Southern gentleman, author Fenton Johnson.
Sure. I'll take that. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
You know, it's always nice hearing your voice, not only hearing your voice reading your works, but also hearing it because it's the voice of my childhood. I was often told that when I was a boy, Virginia and Kentucky were sister states, and you sound a lot like all the people I grew up with.
Kentucky is a wannabe Virginia.
Well, I would have said Virginia was a wannabe Kentucky too, so you see. But what was it like growing up as a gay boy in Kentucky?
Well, I grew up in an area called the Knobs, which is really remote. We made whiskey. That's what we did. These days, we grow pot. That's what we do. And that's what people do to make a living. My father was a maintenance worker for Seagram's. I'm the 9th of 9 children. And
there wasn't a lot going on back then. They had to do something.
Exactly. And you know, I grew up very close to a Trappist monastery, a famous Trappist monastery where Thomas Merton wrote Abbey of Gethsemane. And the monks would sneak out of the monastery at night and come to my parents' house to drink beer and smoke cigarettes and watch football on television. So there was civilization. You know, they brought civilization from places that were so exotic to me, like Trenton, New Jersey, and Detroit, and Cleveland, you know, these exotic Midwesterners who came. But they did bring a kind of intellectual life. My mother was the only person in town who read books. She founded a library. There was no library in the town with books that the monks gave her. So, you know, it was, that aspect of it was good. Working the farm was good. It was terribly, terribly lonely, of course, and an old story. And I don't know when I first discovered that there was a big outside world. I knew that I always wanted to go to California. That was, I do not remember not wanting to come to California.
Yeah, I remember when I was a boy in Richmond, there was a Time magazine that was talking about the opening of the Trans-America Pyramid. And it had in the middle of it, it was a fold-out, like one of those pop-up books, and it had a pop-up Trans-America Pyramid. I wish I still had it.
Well, I remember that there was a Life magazine which had the Santa Clara High School swim team, which was the national champions. And I was so astonished, first of all, that men could look like that, and secondly, that they would pose in Speedos shamelessly, you know, and I kept
thank God for it.
Life magazine for a long time.
You see, our literary pursuits brought us west.
That's exactly correct.
You know, I didn't, I guess I'd heard you talk about that influence of the Trappist monks before. For me, it was the Benedictine monks of Belmont, North Carolina, and I spent a couple of summers there thinking, like all good Catholic boys in the South, that I might go on to become a priest or a monk. And that was one of the first times that I realized there was also a gay life outside of my own aspirations, that there was this kind of undercover gay life in Catholicism and in, you know, the monastery. Was there any of that with the Trappist monks? Did you ever feel that some of them were more than just religiously inclined?
Well, it's a great story. It's these monk stories are in both of the two most recent books. I was named, they'd run out of names, so my parents gave me to the monks to be named, and Brother Fenton was the baker at the monastery, and he disappeared when I was about 5 years old. He used to make me these fantastically elaborate Mickey Mouse cake this big with the face of Mickey Mouse and whatever. He disappeared when I was around 5, and then he came back with a man when I was about 16 for a New Year's Eve party. And everybody got really drunk, and my mother would get up on top of the table and dance with the monks, and it was fairly, I mean, that was life in New Haven, Kentucky. I just assumed this is what everybody did on New Year's Eve. But the silence that surrounded their coming, that's how I understood that these men were lovers. That was my first introduction to the concept that men could be lovers, because.
And how old were you at the time?
16. And if he had been a friend, everybody would have talked about him. If Brother Fenton had brought a woman, there would have been all this gossip about, gee, you think they might get married or whatever. But there was total silence about the fact that this man had come. And I knew, as you knew, surely, there was only one subject that could invoke a silence that was that big and that impenetrable, and that was sex. So these two men must be having sex. That's how I, came to the conclusion. So Brother Fenton, my namesake, turned out to be a gay monk. I visited him before he died, so there was that introduction.
And what was that experience like? Again, you're meeting your namesake before he died. Mine was a crooked Southern lawyer, so so I didn't have such a romantic namesake.
They were cool guys. They lived in a trailer outside of Carbondale, Illinois, in a sort of rural gay life that he had found for himself. He became a baker at Southern Illinois University. And I'm really grateful that I met him. The Trappist, the most recent book, Keeping Faith, I deliberately sought out some of the monks whom I knew would talk to me about being gay, and particularly difficult in the Trappists, because the Trappists are an order that is sworn to silence, and so they're more explicitly macho than the Benedictines, who are more oriented toward education, intellectual, exactly. So to talk to the Trappists who were gay was quite an interesting experience.
I mean, to even say to talk to the Trappist.
Yeah, well, exactly. It was, when you get them in conversation, they are talkers, because they've been silent for a long time. And there was a really interesting experience, which was the abbot at Gethsemani at the time was a forward-thinking guy. That has all changed. But then they had a forward-thinking guy. And there was a woman Trappist, a Trappistine, who was at a monastery in Northern California, up by Leggett, called Our Lady of the Redwoods. And there was some trouble up there, and he invited her to come and live at the Abbey of Gethsemani. And so during the years that I was writing Keeping Faith, when I was intermittently allowed to live in the monastery with the monks, there was this woman who had grown up in a poor family in Mexico, who herself was Mexican, and she was living as a woman Trappist amid this community of men. And she and I became very close to each other. And it was particularly fascinating, of course, to get her take on the community and what was the role of women in institutionalized religion in general, what was her role in being there. She was very well suited to the place she wanted to stay. Her name was Sister Maricela Garcia. And, much of the privilege of writing that book, and it was a privilege, was talking to these people who had made a lifetime mission out of studying wisdom and asking them, about their thoughts.
Right. Now, your book, Geography of the Heart, certainly made you a household name.
Last week it was astonishing but true. 17 years after its publication, number 20 on the Amazon memoir best-selling list.
Right. Now you have a new series of books, and actually they're both about to be audiobooks, correct?
Geography of the Heart and Keeping Faith will come out as audiobooks in the coming month.
So who's the voice?
Well, I insisted on reading Geography of the Heart.
I'm so glad.
Because, it's a deeply personal book. It's the story of my partner, who was the only child of Holocaust survivors who died of AIDS in 1990. And I tell the story of his family surviving the Holocaust and his growing up as the only child of Holocaust survivors. And my story is the ninth of 9 children of a moonshiner in Appalachia.
Right, and then going through the Holocaust of what AIDS is.
And then the years of AIDS, although the motivation behind that book, we had seen a series of marvelous books, Paul Manette, David Feinberg, but all written very understandably out of what I would call anger. And my experience of the epidemic had been one of love. Witnessing people who, at that point, we didn't know how the disease was caused. We didn't know that you couldn't get the disease by a sneeze or a handshake. And yet people came together to take care of their own. And I wanted to write a book about that phenomenon of watching this, participating in this community coming together in that way.
I think you'll understand this. I hope so. I remember those years and was not as impacted as losing a lover, but certainly went to dozens of memorials, saw friends one day at a party and the next day, oh, where are they? They're gone. Watching the Bay Area Reporter have a double truck of obituaries. But out of that period, as you say, there was a lot of love. There was a sense of community. And I sense sometimes that people, and I'll admit it, miss that sense of community. Do you?
Yes, I have, I'll say something that may be a storm of mail, but I cannot be other than wildly enthusiastic about the progress that we are making on marriage rights. However, a friend of mine, a lesbian historian, says that, offered me the observation, and she's put it in writing, that Martha Feynman, that she did not think that the kind of community that arose in the 80s could have arisen in the presence of institutionalized marriage. That kind of community without boundaries really required a kind of looseness of
and a
social
radicalism.
structure and a radicalism. I think we're facing that challenge now, again, in a way, because as I heard Marcy Edelman point out at a Horizons Foundation meeting recently, the profile of our community, you know, it's wonderful that we're making this progress on marriage equality, but the profile of our community in San Francisco is that it is aging and single. And she said, you know, what is the Horizons Foundation doing for that community? And at least on that particular panel, nobody was able to answer the question. And I think one of the definitions of a community is that it takes care of its own. Mm-hmm. And how we are going to, I mean, this of course is a national challenge as well as a challenge that we're facing, but how we take care of each other as we move into old age, it's a great adventure. You know, it's a challenge, but it's a great adventure.
What's next for you? You've written, you know, you have essays. I've heard you speak. There is a tone to your writing which is very inviting. It is kind of like a Southern drawl. And, you know, you're listening to someone, and maybe that's why I've always loved it so much. It's the rhythm of the childhood I had, which was also very rural. You know, I remember when I came out to my family after many years, finally my cousin Claire back in Virginia on the phone said, well, Sugar, we've always known you were gay. We thought you were dying of AIDS. And I said, no. And she said, well, that's not why you're coming out. I said, no, I just couldn't take it anymore. And she said, you know, Sugar, she said, just because we're farmers doesn't mean we're all hicks. And she really put me in my place. So did you find also, in just our closing moments, that your childhood, although it was rural and wasn't very urban and sophisticated, was one of acceptance?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, my mother said when I told her, my mother who always was careful to use correct grammar around us because she wanted us to go out in the world, into the world with correct grammar. When I told her, she said, I kind of suspicioned as much. And I think it was, she wanted to be cool, but, you know, the coming out moment was still a moment for her in some way. But I think that it really is true that there's a kind of strength that came out of that time. I'm writing now a book about what it means to be single in the world, what it is to, what kind of contribution to community, what is the role of a single person in the world. So I don't know what the title is going to be, but the subtitle is probably going to be For Those Who Have Lived a Long Time Alone. And that's kind of addressing this, it is addressing this notion that we have a community that is aging and single. And I wrote a book about love, and now I want to write a book about love in a different way.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us, Fenton. I know you're only here in the area about once every 6 months, so the next time you're around, we're going to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Fenton Johnson. Next up, we'll meet gay musician Elton, as in L10. I'll be right back.